This 911 call literally sparks one of the strangest investigations when it comes down to a mother's absolute betrayal.
There's too much at my house and my daughter just got shot, man. Please hurry. I'm on this awesome drive.
Right, she just got shot right now.
Yes.
Who did it? The guy that's walking to your door?
Yes.
Okay, what's your name, honey?
Hi guys, welcome back. Wow. Today's case. Listen, I get it. People lie all the time when it comes down to crime. That's literally the MO of criminals. But there is something about this case that provokes so many feelings within me, and they will within you, because there is something about a mother who just betrays a child in the most heinous of ways and then thinks that somehow she can lie her way out of it. And it's one of those cases where the lies border on what can only be described as bizarre. And isn't it weird that you have people in this world who believe they can outplay seasoned investigators and detectives? This case examples two things. Firstly, a mother who believes that she does not deserve to face justice for clearly being involved in the death of her own child. And secondly, an individual who would hang anyone out to dry, you and I included, if it meant that she saved her own skin. This is the absolutely traumatic case of Destiny Oliver. Before I kick off with it, however, I just want to say I release my deep dive crime content twice weekly, and I will do ad infinitum. And if you like what you see here, you can get lots more on Patreon and also my YouTube community. Thanks to all of you who are also supporting me on my YouTube membership and my Patreon. I can't make this content without you. I hope you enjoy all your full-length content that you're getting and the extra podcasts, etc. over there. Thank you so much. But like I said, if you haven't subscribed, please do it. Get your notifications on and also give me a like, because apparently that helps me get out to other people. Right, let's talk about this case. And it is going to be one of those that drives you a little bit to distraction. It begins on September the 14th, 2019. This is when the absolutely adorable, beautiful Destiny Oliver is fatally shot inside her own home. Now, bear in mind that in itself is a tragedy beyond measure, and it's really unusual. A 5-year-old getting shot. It's not as if a 5-year-old is in a situation where there's any kind of emotional issue with another human being to the degree that they want to kill them. We do work in scenarios where family annihilation takes place and children are murdered, but that tends to be by a male perpetrator, and it tends to be the parent in the case. But this doesn't follow that pattern at all. So basically, emergency services are called to Destiny's home, and at this point, everything starts to spiral. It's as simple as that, because this genuinely is one of those cases where the lying is just so enormous, and it comes from the very person that should be the most protective of all over this child, which is a mother. So before we break down and analyse the case itself, let's talk about Robin Howington, who is the mother in this case. She actually had 4 children. She had 3 sons and her daughter who's victim, Destiny Oliver. Now, Destiny is only aged 5 at the point of her death. And she also has a 2-year-old son who's going to very much play into this story. And I suppose when it comes down to people analysing the character of Destiny, who was 5, obviously she's a beautiful, innocent little girl. She's gorgeous to look at. Also, it was said that she was just one of those kids who loved the outdoors. She was really bright. She was really energetic. She was always playing outside. She loved school. And it's also interesting that the 2-year-old, who, like I said, plays into this case, they're described by neighbours as sweet but vulnerable. And I find that a really interesting use of words, sweet but vulnerable, because it says that there must have been behaviours that were noted by neighbours that made them believe that that child was vulnerable. Now, obviously, every 2-year-old child is vulnerable. It goes without saying. I have one myself, very vulnerable, can't leave them anywhere by themselves because, you know, they're going to eat the wallpaper and they're going to get themselves into trouble. I'm not saying that my daughter eats wallpaper before anybody starts commenting that I need to get that treated. But you know what I'm saying. Of course they're vulnerable, but I think that use of words is really interesting by the neighbours, because it speaks of them thinking that maybe something wasn't too positive occurring in that household, and that made them even more vulnerable than they would have been otherwise. Now, within the community of her neighbourhood, She was described as quite a loving and caring mother, to be fair, but that they all noted that she had financial struggles and health struggles as well, and also in particular some mental health struggles. Some members of the community described her as withdrawn, with a history of emotional volatility, and apparently this was linked to past traumas and ongoing mental health struggles. So that, again, there's a dichotomy there. You've got, on one hand, people saying that she was loving and caring, but then you have others who seem to be closer to her situation, who talk about her having quite serious ongoing mental health struggles and also being quite withdrawn and volatile, which is, again, another interesting word, which suggests that there is instability in the household. And certainly I would err on the side of that being the correct characterization because of what I'm going to tell you about this case. Now, acquaintances of Robin, they said that she'd battled PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and this was due to earlier traumatic experiences that had been caused specifically by several years of physical and domestic abuse. This was by her previous husband, a guy called Richard Howington. Richard apparently would threaten her, would intimidate her, and she was kept in what would be considered a constant state of hypervigilance and anxiety. Now, that's a really debilitating experience for anyone. Some of you yourself might have gone through periods of this, particularly in relation to post-trauma. And when we're talking about people being in a constant state of hypervigilance and anxiety, we're talking about individuals who have this heightened sense of alertness and this constant anticipation of danger. And obviously that can lead to feelings of anxiety, emotional stress, exhaustion, and it can manifest itself in a whole range of ways, really. But one of the things that I would say, having worked therapeutically with individuals in this state, it's just constantly needing to scan your environment for threats. You'll really be hypersensitive to sensory experience, like any loud noises or any quick movements. That's going to affect you. And also it will play into affecting the way that you relax or sleep. And that can obviously lead to absolute physical and mental health issues, because exhaustion alone can drive us to the brink. And she certainly seems to have those manifested. So, like I said, it certainly feels like there's a level of instability in that household. And that's before we add children to the mix. I mean, if you are a parent, you adore your children, they're the world. And of course, this can lead to levels of frustration both with you and with your children because you don't feel that you're able to give them what they need. So that's all going on in the backdrop to this particular case, but we're not going to allow her mental health issues to be the reason behind her actions, because it just does not add up as far as I'm concerned. And I'm very experienced in this area, and I'm telling you from my understanding of this case, that is not the primary issue here. The primary issue is we're dealing with a pathological liar. Genuinely, it's like this woman is gonna just allow the lies to trip off her tongue as if it is second nature. Now, the upbringing of her children did have documentation that talked about a history of domestic instability, and there had been previous involvement from Child Protective Services. But it's also worth noting that there hadn't ever been any reports of major abuse that had risen before the shooting. So what's playing out there is that they have had engagement, but they've never got to the point where they felt that the child or children need to be removed because of red flags that suggest any kind of physical, emotional, sexual abuse. I would argue that that's a misstep because I think there is clearly neglect in this case. But like I said, it hasn't been warranted to a position where the children have been taken. So social services had attended multiple visits to the home during her bringing up of Destiny and her younger brothers Jeremiah, Trey and 2-year-old Gavin. So this is something that has been a relatively regular feature. And social services did report something that blows my mind when I think about the acceptability of allowing children to remain with a parent in spite of the fears and concerns that social services had, because they said that they were worried about the fact that she had unsecured firearms. Unsecured firearms when there are children around. Surely if you can't secure a firearm when you've got kids around, that's neglect. Because we know that terrible tragedies play out. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's rare for children to kill themselves or others with a gun, but it happens. But they know that there are these unsecured firearms. Also, they note that it seems to be an unsafe environment for children, so why not take action? But I would imagine the reasoning behind that is because if they took action on every family like that, then it could be that they would have an unsustainable care system, because many, many people will potentially fall into that category. So they're obviously looking at these children and thinking they're not in a safe environment, but it's not so unsafe that we need to remove them. Also, it was found that she had, as a mother, experimented with marijuana. Now, I appreciate that in lots of places in America, and actually in the world, it is completely legal to smoke weed, but it was actually illegal in the state of Tennessee at the time. So, with respect, she is taking recreational drugs that are not considered appropriate. And if you add to that all the things I've just told you about her mental health conditions and the issues that she's suffering emotionally, it could potentially exacerbate some of those. And I know that a lot of people are really pro-weed and that cannabis absolutely has the most healing powers in many different ways. But the levels that we see of things like THC can definitely distort the way that people think and feel, because illegal THC tends to be hydroponically grown in ways that makes it super strong and isn't necessarily that positive for you on a mental health level. That's why we know that a lot of people go into psychosis, for example. And I appreciate, like I said, that when it's managed appropriately, particularly medicinally, it can absolutely have positive effects. But again, it tells you that she's got some low boundaries. And it also seems to play into the indication that she did have really quite a lot of difficulty managing stress, and she was struggling with single motherhood, and she was struggling with financial problems. So you can add all of those to the mix. Now, neighbours, they described the house as quiet, but they also said it was very chaotic. Occasionally there were loud arguments, but there hadn't been any police logs where people had called in to the police because they were concerned about things going on under the roof, or that they were worried about the noise, because obviously people constantly call the police about noise pollution, and that hadn't happened. But it feels like there was always this being on the brink and boundary of complaints and the concerns with social care, that they're walking that very fine line of allowing the children to stay, but also having these really warranted fears about what might happen if they stay. But like I said, no actual action was taken. Now, at the time of poor Destiny losing her life, Robin had actually separated from her now ex-boyfriend, Antoine Oliver. So Antoine Oliver is actually the father to Destiny. And Antoine's going to get brought into this case because, like I said, Robin struggles with the truth. So she's going to try and create as many fall guys as possible to make herself seem innocent. Now, he was involved in the children's lives, but he wasn't living full-time in the household. And initially, Antoine described her as a mother who cared deeply for her children, but apparently struggled with making consistent, safe choices, especially regarding household safety, which absolutely mirrors what social services were saying. But that kind of comment changes. And it changes evidentially because of what she decides to do when she's trying to fabricate to get herself away with this crime. So once the truth comes to light, because she basically implicates him, he changes his mind, as many people would, and he described Robin as someone who cared nothing about Destiny, only herself. And he stated, "Robin is the reason my daughter is dead. I want her to rot in prison." So quite a shift from she's a really loving and caring mother, got a few problems too, I want her dead. It's as simple as that. That's basically his sentiments at that moment in time. But like I said, there is really a clear sentiment that we all will understand in that particular statement, because she tries to implicate him. And that's just an awful situation to go through if you end up as a main suspect in the death of your own child. So let's go back to the date of the crime and talk about how this played out. So it was September the 14th, 2019. It was about 8:30 p.m. At this point, Tennessee Police Department receive a call where a mother is attempting to appear distressed. And it's not reported that way. It's often reported that she did come across as frantic and distressed, but I've played it and you will have heard it, and I just don't buy into that. I really don't. I think there's a disconnect. I think it's very acted, and she's trying to avoid answering questions, and it just feels very contrived. Also, bear in mind what she is saying and the fact that this is all lies, and that just adds to the concern that I have about the way that she comes across on that call. Now, Robin Howington at this point tells the authorities that her daughter Destiny horrifically has been shot inside their home by an unknown intruder. Now, she actually said he was an unknown black male. Let's just blame a black guy. With respect, I might be sounding trite when I say that, but you know why I'm saying it. Because this is a story that's told so frequently. When people act illegally and harm somebody that's close to them, they will often throw in the idea that a black guy is responsible. And that just demonstrates their mindset, that they feel that the likelihood is it will be believed if they throw in ethnicity and a male to this situation. And that is actually really upsetting, because there have been men, black men in particular, who have been found guilty of crimes they never committed. Because in particular, white people, and I'm not coming in and hard and down on the fact that race plays massively into every crime. I know that, but I'm saying examples exist. And I know they exist for white guys as well. But predominantly it's black guys that get blamed for things that they never did and actually end up sometimes on death row for them. And the very fact that she's introducing that possibility means she's introducing the possibility that an innocent person will be found guilty, potentially, of a crime they didn't commit. So it's not just a lie. There's a serious intention there, because it would blame another human being who wasn't even present, and that human being could get consequences that were literally deadly. Now, when she's having this conversation, she also is able to describe the car he allegedly left in, which was a black Chrysler 300. Put yourself in the position of a mother whose child has just been attacked by a stranger in your own home. She's bleeding out on the couch. How would you know what car he'd arrived in or left in? Where is your head going to be? You're going to be with your daughter. You're not going to be checking outside who's leaving. You'll have heard the gunshot. You'll have seen your child get injured. That's your main concern. If my daughter had been shot in my own home, I wouldn't have a clue what car somebody left in. I'd be struggling to find my mobile to call emergency services because the trauma would be so huge. Now, while she's on the phone to that dispatch, she's describing the situation to them as chaotic, that she's terrified, that she was basically trying to protect Destiny from this stranger who just walked into her home with a firearm and then unloaded it into her daughter's chest. The dispatcher stays on the line. Obviously, one of the things that they're doing is they're providing Robin with instructions. They're alerting the emergency responders to the address. And literally within minutes, the police and paramedics are there. They understandably have to enter the home cautiously because they notice that there's no signs of forced entry. And therefore, they're already starting to think to themselves, is this actually a scenario that's ringing true? Or do we need to be super careful about somebody who might have a weapon that might still be in the house? Now, it's really awful what they actually find at that scene, because beautiful 5-year-old Destiny, she's in such a state. She's got a bullet in her chest. She's literally bleeding out on the sofa. And at this point, Robin is just sat next to her. Now, Robin is acting really weirdly. So she's on the phone. She didn't even seem to notice when the first responders took her daughter from the couch to work on her outside, which just blows my mind and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. At this point, they rush Destiny to hospital, giving her emergency medical treatment. They also give her surgery. They give her intensive care, trying to save her life. But within a few hours, she sadly dies. And Robin, her mother, doesn't even make it to hospital to see her because the time frame is so short between her being taken and her sadly passing away. Now, bear in mind, when all this is played out, the 2-year-old brother Gavin's also present. So he has seen all of this occur in front of his eyes. A 2-year-old. It's absolutely harrowing. The last images of his sister is her bleeding out on the couch. And of course, when you think about the furore that's playing out with emergency services, just trying to make sure that Destiny's getting the right kind of treatment, what would he require? Well, usually it would be nurture, care and attention, but mother, in this case, Robin, is just kind of very concerned with her phone and is distracted. And so the emergency responders can't do very much for him because their priority is Destiny. So he's dealing with this on an independent level, which is going to have ramifications for him in the future. And the fact that he was very distressed, that demonstrates that he's having one of those really emotionally reactive experiences, going to embed in trauma in the future. Now, the responders at the scene, they initially trust her account. So she's telling them about this black guy who's come in, killed her daughter, basically. And they just take that as verbatim, that must be true. But it doesn't take very long for them to start becoming really suspicious. And this is actually before the proper investigation's begun. And the main reasoning behind this is because she's so inconsistent about what happened. And you're going to know what happened if you're in the eye of the storm. And she was apparently in the eye of the storm watching this all play out. And I guess before we even move on to what those stories are, you've got to ask yourself this very clear question. Why would any guy come to your home, walk into your home, and then literally shoot your child? Why? Like, what's the motivation? Even coming into your home and shooting you as an adult, that's a strange turn of events. If they're not coming to steal from you and you've got into a tussle and you've got shot during that altercation, even that is rare. But the idea that some random guy just pulls up in his Chrysler, gets out, comes into your house, kills your child, walks away, that in itself is so unique, because these things don't happen. There usually is a motive, either an intimate connection where somebody's planned a hit, or a robbery gone wrong, and even that's rare. And this just does not make sense. Now, understandably, because it's now a crime scene, they secure the actual environment, collect forensic evidence to start their investigation. So the beginning of the suspicions towards Robin, they begin really, really early on. Now, there's a whole heap of reasons why the investigators get suspicious towards Robin, but I would say that one of the pivotal moments is when she's at hospital. And obviously, this is at a point where Destiny has passed away, and the investigators are obviously treating her kindly and compassionately. They did say that she didn't react how a typical mother reacts when they're told that their child has died. That was somewhat a red flag. Apparently she seemed solemn and somber, but certainly not hysterical or devastated. And also for a period of time, she's constantly on her phone, just constantly on her phone and like distracted from the situation itself. Again, if my child had just died, I would be with their body. It's as simple as that. Like, I would be like over their body holding them. And I don't think that is an atypical reaction. I think that is a totally typical reaction. You just have this desire to be connected to your child, alive or dead. It's as simple as that. And so she's in a family room. She isn't acting in that typical way. But also, the officer understandably needs to say to her, look, can I take your phone? Because it's going to be evidence. And she is resistant to do that. He doesn't immediately take it, and he said that was a regretful choice, because at that point he was feeling that she had lost a child. He understood that she might need to make some emergency calls to family and friends so that she didn't need to be alone. And he said that was a misstep and a mistake on his part when he appeared in court giving evidence, but he allows her a period of time alone with the phone. So what does she do with this phone? Because obviously, bear in mind, she's talking about the fact that she's a victim of a crime. She's not a perpetrator, so why is there a problem handing over a phone to the police? Even if you do have some saucy pictures on there, or maybe some inappropriate text to your sister about how you're planning the demise of your mother. I do that quite a lot, but it's only for jokes. But I hate to imagine them reading it out cold in court. I would definitely get sentenced. The point is, we all have stuff on our phone that we would rather not have investigators read. But again, if you are dealing with your child's murder and your phone is going to be useful for whatever reason, you're going to hand it over happily. Not quite the memo that Robin got. What she actually did, she went to the toilet, she found a stranger, as in somebody she absolutely did not know, and she tried to give them the phone. Can you just have my phone? I don't want your phone. Please have my phone. I don't want your phone. No, have my phone. Why are you giving me your phone? I just don't want it anymore. I mean, that's the bizarre bizarre action. Now, when that perplexed individual who refused to take the phone doesn't actually go ahead and help her, Robin is left with a problem. She's still got hold of the phone, and obviously she's decided she doesn't want to hold that phone any longer. And then she goes into the bathroom of the hospital with it. And what can we note? We can note that it's going to be damaged shortly afterwards. Now, bear in mind, when the officer returns to collect the phone, it's soaking wet. She literally tried to sink the phone in the bathroom because she had been unable to pass it on to the stranger. And essentially her excuse for this was, oh, I thought that maybe you'd arrest me for drug use. Again, if your child's just died, just been murdered by a stranger, is that where your head goes? I need to protect myself, I need to save my own skin. It just isn't a psychological reaction that's conducive to a loving parent. It suggests that you are trying to hide something, and undoubtedly that's an immediate big red flag for the authorities. Now, later, evidence was discovered on her phone that contradicted a lot of the stories and the claims that she made to the legal individuals that obviously were prosecuting her, and understandably made that quite difficult for the defence as well. Now, one of the serious crime officers who asked her for the phone, like I said, he regretfully said that he allowed her to keep it too long. He then took it back to the office, back to the station. He got a bucket, he filled it with rice, and he basically salvaged it. So that meant that it was able to be digitally analysed. Now, bear in mind, this is playing out at the same time that the crime scene is being dealt with. Now, early on, they ruled out forced entry. There were no broken windows, there were no issues with locks or doors. So after some very careful searches and diligent searches of the house, the suspicion of a forced entry from an intruder was completely ruled out. And forensic evidence actually showed gunshot residue on Robin's hands and clothing from a 9mm handgun, which was actually later discovered hidden in a hole in the backyard wrapped in cloth. The actual gun that had clearly caused the injury and subsequent death of Destiny. Yeah, it's buried in the backyard, wrapped in cloth. Now, riddle me this. If apparently some guy has come in and killed her daughter with a gun, why on earth would you have the gun residue on your hand, and how would that end up buried? It's not as if the intruder's going to be like, oh, I've got time. I need to dispose of this weapon. I know, I'll just bury it at the victim's home whilst there are people calling emergency services. It makes perfect sense. Why don't we go ahead and do that? That again provokes an obvious visceral and cerebral reaction from the actual officers, because they know they're dealing with a liar at this point, and this is a liar who's a mother in the case of a child's death. Also, another thing that really concerned the investigators was that the 2-year-old little boy's fingerprints were on the weapon. So that again validates what social services were saying, that the gun had been left accessible and this child had clearly handled it at some point. And that in itself is a highly neglectful reality. Now, Robin's initial claim on the scene, like I've said, is that this unknown intruder has shot Destiny. But then she decides, oh, I don't know whether that's going down well. Don't know whether that's really fitting the bill when it comes down to me seeming innocent in this case. So instead, I'm going to blame my ex-boyfriend, Antoine. So she literally changes her account and says, actually, it wasn't this intruder. It was my ex-boyfriend, Antoine. Now, again, if it was your current partner, some people might have a really bizarre loyalty complex and try to prevent them from getting into trouble by saying it was an intruder when actually it was their partner. That would be very rare, and it would make you a callous individual at the highest level, but that could happen. The idea that you would have an ex-boyfriend who you'd broken up with, who apparently had been nasty to you and you'd suffered domestic abuse from him, because that's what she said, why would you try to protect him? Just using that logic, oh, I get violently abused by this man and he's come in, he's now killed my child, and I thought I'd just make up a story about an intruder. That does not make sense at all. So she doesn't just say that Antoine had actually killed her child. She then starts to speak really negatively about him. She talks about domestic abuse from him. She talks about the fact that they're buying and selling drugs together in the local area. And that inconsistency in the accusations that she's just throwing at different people, that creates further suspicion. But Antoine at this point gets named as a suspect, which must have been absolutely devastating for him. Now, it was noted at this point that there was a history of domestic violence, apparently, and that meant that because he was a suspect in this case, he couldn't attend Destiny's funeral. Can you imagine being an innocent man who's been accused unfairly by your ex, and it's been taken seriously enough to mean that you don't get to say goodbye? That was denied him because of her fabrication, because of her lies. And again, what does that say about her? What kind of a human being is willing to lie so dramatically that it literally will stain the conscience of the innocent person for the rest of their being, because they will not be able to make peace with the prevention of them being able to attend rightfully the funeral of his child? He actually said, they ruined my life while I was trying to get through the process of the death of my baby girl. We lost our daughter because of reckless choices that should never have been made. And for him, that wound is just going to be exacerbated, isn't it? Now, the recorded initial interviews did indicate that this kind of framing of Antoine was basically when Robin latched onto the investigators' suspicions of Antoine. So they were obviously throwing potential suspects at her, saying, well, you know, maybe trying to protect somebody. You know, that's what they do in investigations, isn't it? You see detectives do it all the time. They kind of do that. I know you're a really good person, but people who are good do bad things. It doesn't make you a bad person. When really they're thinking you're a really bad person, you've done a really bad thing, and I want to get you into court and make sure that you go down for the rest of your natural life. That's what they actually mean. And it's the same when they're like, are you sure it was a stranger? Could it not have been somebody that, you know, you were involved with and that you were afraid of? And again, they're just looking for people to either change their story or, of course, throw a suspect that might be guilty into the mix. And so she kind of understands that's playing out and thinks that it's a hook that she can kind of latch onto. And so she thinks, yeah, they want to hear that he's the actual violent partner. He's the person who's killed this child. And that makes sense to them. So I'm going to go with that at a cost entirely to Antoine. Now, a list of photos of suspects were actually shown to her, and she actually circled a photo of Antoine. Now, I find it a bit weird anyway that the coppers would do that. I mean, if you're a detective and you're literally saying, oh, which one of these suspects could it be? And one is your ex that you've kind of indicated is guilty, you're not going to be like, oh, I don't recognise any of them. I mean, of course you're going to recognise your ex-boyfriend. You have a child with them for a start. So again, seems a little bit strange that they did that, but they're obviously just trying to make sure that she indicates who is apparently guilty of this horrific crime. But even that isn't quite as suspicious as, I suppose, what plays out next. It's the discovery of the hidden firearm in the back garden that really sparks alarms for the investigators, because they find CCTV evidence of her walking outside to the garden to literally place it there. So that totally changes the trajectory of the case. So just bear it in mind that she's initially created this ruse of an intruder. Now she's tried to blame the ex-boyfriend, and now she's basically been seen burying a gun in the garden. So it makes no sense whatsoever what she's saying. And the footage, that CCTV, showed that it was minutes between her hiding the gun and the 911 call. So what would you do in that situation? Where would your concern be? Would you leave a child bleeding to death on a couch to go and bury a weapon? And of course, she's denied that initially. She said that she didn't do that, but she's been captured because she's literally on videotape doing it. Now, evidence on the phone that she tried desperately to get rid of, that shows text from Robin asking a friend of hers to go to her house to remove the gun to basically prevent the investigators finding it. So this is during the time that the investigation had actually begun. So she's trying her best to implicate her friends at this point, because you become a co-conspirator if you actually go ahead and do that. And unfortunately, that person didn't do it because it got sense. So what does that tell you about her mindset? It's not telling you that she's a victim in this case. It's telling you that she's a perpetrator. And the only thing she's concerned about, even though her daughter has died horribly, is saving her own skin, which is about as distinct as one can imagine you would be as a mother in general circumstances. Now, once Robin's informed by the investigators that they're aware of the gun, Unbelievably, this woman, who was literally told so many lies, decides to change her story again. And this is where, like I said, it borders on absolutely bizarre, because she quickly moves the blame from Antoine to her 2-year-old son, Gavin. Let that sink in. Her 2-year-old son. Now, bear in mind, there are fingerprints on the gun which match the toddler's, but that isn't implicating the toddler actually firing the gun. And just think about the actual use of a gun where a toddler is concerned, of 2 years old. We're not talking about a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, we're talking about a 2-year-old. We're thinking about their dexterity, their strength, etc. Guns are not made for children. There is a certain leverage required physically to shoot them, for good reason. We don't want them going off all the time because people get injured and killed. But it makes sense that the fingerprints are on the gun, because we know from what has been put forward by social services is that children have had access to touching those actual weapons. And it would be the same in my house. Look, if I had a gun hanging around, without a shadow of a doubt, my little girl would go and grab it, because kids pick up anything, particularly dangerous things. It's like they're hardwired. What can I harm myself with? Oh, I'll just pick up this axe I found. No, before anybody complains, I haven't got a child who has access to an axe. But you know what I'm saying? The reality is that children are inquisitive and curious, so it makes sense that he has gone over and played with the gun. Now, in spite of this story being told at this point, they will bring in forensic experts down the line, and understandably, they will actually cite that the 2-year-old would have had a lack of motor control, and because of their size, it would have been highly unlikely that the gun would have been used by him. Now, I appreciate it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. I will tell you about the amount of kids that have killed people towards the end of this particular story, but nonetheless, it's very unlikely. And also, we're talking about if that had really played out, if you were a mother in a scenario where your child has been shot accidentally by your other child, you're going to think, oh my God, it's my fault to some degree. There's accountability and responsibility that I've been neglectful in my parenting. And you might have the full weight of the law come down on you because of that. But that's very different than trying to implicate all these other people for a very serious murder. It would make sense to investigators that accidents happen, and if that could be proved that an accident had happened, people would still see you not as a horrendous monster, but actually as a mother who made a horrendous mistake. And they are very different quotients when it comes down to people's perception. But like I said, this is a story she's now telling, that basically she's in a situation where she didn't know what to do. Her child has killed her other child. So she decided to make up a whole heap of lies to protect the child, no doubt, which again, makes no sense. I'm just going to throw it out there. I've been around a long time, and no 2-year-old has ever been charged with murder and imprisoned. That does not happen. They're 2. So actually, it would have been a safe bet to tell the truth in that case if that was actually what played out. The only reason you wouldn't tell that story is because it isn't truth. And actually, it's just another convenient ruse to deflect from your own guilt. Now, forensics also discovered the bullet residue on Robin's dominant hand. Now, my dominant hand is this hand. That would be the one that I would use to pull the trigger. And so if you were going to find residue, it would be on that hand. Why has she got residue on her hand from that gun unless she has used it? Also, when they do toxicology reports, she tested positive for marijuana use, and they also found evidence of a tampering with the soil around the area the weapon was buried. Also, there were these massive discrepancies between her report of events and the forensic timeline, so everything that's come out of her mouth is an absolute lie. Now, footage also shows Robin returning to the house with investigators, and basically at this point attempting her best effort at explaining how her 2-year-old son had accidentally shot Destiny. Now, bear in mind, what's the problem with this kind of testimony to the police? Well, her recollection doesn't match up with the forensic evidence. So she can try to lay herself out of this, but it's not going to work because they're actually doing a diligent job and nothing is matching up at all. Now, like I said, just because I know that some of you will say, well, it is possible that a 2-year-old could use a gun. I will agree that data shows that since 2015, there have been at least 895 children aged 5 and under who have either unintentionally shot themselves or shot someone else. And in 2023, it was just an absolutely exploding year. There were over 400 such incidents. That's the worst yet on record. It does happen, but bear in mind, under 5, a 4-year-old is totally different to a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old, I would say it would be uncanny, on the whole, like 99% of the time, to actually go ahead and utilise a gun, to actually have it loaded, cock it, shoot it, etc. It just doesn't make sense whatsoever. Now, understandably, the police believe that they have the correct suspect in their sights, which is, of course, Robin. She ends up getting arrested on September the 17th, 2019. And when it comes down to her charges, well, what can I say? Charges as long as my arm, and rightfully so. I mean, just perverting the course of justice with the lies, to me, is enough for her to have a strong custodial sentence when you think about the gravity of what we're talking about. We're talking about the death of a 5-year-old child in horrific circumstances, and here she is just absolutely fabricating every circumstance and situation. So she ends up getting indicted by a grand jury, and she's charged with really serious offences, which she should do, because they reflect the gravity of the situation and also her alleged actions. So first-degree murder, that charge basically indicated the allegation that she unlawfully killed her daughter during the perpetration of aggravated child neglect. Then there's aggravated child neglect. So that was based on the circumstances leading to Destiny's death, which basically is talking about this massive failure to protect her child, to provide the necessary care for her child that everybody would expect, at the very least, you would be there to do as a parent or carer. Then there's all of the fabrication. So she gets charged with false reporting. So she's accused of giving false statements to the police officers, and that obviously hinders the investigation. It also potentially implicates innocent people, and it also delays justice for Destiny. Then you've got the tampering with evidence. Understandably, she tried to hide the gun. She tried to get rid of her phone. But, you know, basically the weapon itself was hid in a bush by her outside her home, and that's clearly tampering with evidence. Then there's the attempted tampering with evidence, which is more related to the actual cell phone. So she didn't manage to get rid of it, otherwise it would have fell into that tampering with evidence course, but that is an attempted tampering with evidence charge. So this means that she was trying to protect herself because she didn't want the police to know what she'd been involved in, and she didn't want them to know that she'd had some illegal activity in selling drugs, for example. And she, at this point, is then understandably held without bail pending the trial because they were concerned about her being a flight risk, and also because of evidence tampering concerns, because she's clearly got a history of doing that. And this, of course, was all framed in the fact that she had all those massive discrepancies in her recall of information. So she blamed an intruder, then she blamed her ex, then she blamed her 2-year-old son. I bet her neighbours were like, close the curtains, don't let her look in my direction, because they might have got blamed too. Now, another thing that really concerned the investigators about the claim about her child shooting Destiny was that it just sounded so implausible. So she said that her son had used a stool to reach up into the closet to get the pistol. Bear in mind, there's already social services reports saying that the guns were out and accessible to the children anyway in previous visits. So at this point, this 2-year-old, like I said, I've got a 2-year-old, she's absolutely brilliant. I don't think she's a genius, but most little kids of 2, they're inquisitive, they're curious, they're wonderful. But at the end of the day, she is smart. If I had a gun in a closet, first of all, she doesn't know because it's in a closet. Secondly, the idea of my 2-year-old just, I'm just going to find a stool, just drag it over. The stool's going to be tall enough for me to stand on and balance, because 2-year-olds are known for their incredible sense of balance. I'm going to reach up whilst balancing on this chair. I'm just going to get this gun. Now I've got the gun, which is really heavy, but I've got it now. It's in my hand. It's in my hand. I've got it. It's heavy, but it's fine. It's a gun. And I'm going to climb down in spite of the fact that I now have one of my hands holding a gun and I'm 2 balancing on a chair, and then I'm going to get off that chair and I'm going to shoot my sister. The word implausible was designed for such ridiculous scenarios. Also, it came out as well during court that Robin Howington had actually pulled a gun on Destiny's father during an argument just 2 days prior to the incident. So it was available for her. It was within reach. And it also implies that she has the potential to use that gun if she's annoyed. And that's really important. And I think this forms a very important picture which is, of course, that when it comes down to what played out that day where Destiny is concerned, is that it was her mother who actually landed that fatal shot. Now, just to add to that implausibility about the 2-year-old being involved, he had no injury. So if you think about shooting the gun, there'd be a recoil, and that recoil would cause an injury when you were a 2-year-old child because you're so small and you're so delicate. So essentially that's missing. Also, the directory of the shot came from exactly where she was stood, not where she claimed that the shooter had been. So everything forensically is pointing in her direction. And also, she hid the gun and she tried to get rid of the phone. So we know that this is adding up to her being a very guilty party. Now, like in so many cases, they brought in experts, and findings from clinical psychologists said that she did have an impaired mental state due to trauma and substance use, and that this had contributed to poor decision-making on the night of the shooting. I mean, was it just on the night of the shooting? Just going to throw it out there. Was it only on the night of the shooting that she had poor decision-making? Because all she had was poor decision-making. I mean, every single thing she said from that point was just a fabrication. That's not poor decision-making on the night of the shooting. That's her constantly making poor decisions, and she won't have constantly been impaired due to substance use. And also, this is really annoying me because having worked for over 20 years in therapy with clients who are highly traumatized, and I mean, I've worked with clients who are so traumatized that they would be at the very top spectrum when it comes down to CPTSD and PTSD. The horrors that they have endured as children and as adults have been incalculable for most of us to even comprehend. They are the kindest human beings. They're more vulnerable because of what happened to them, not less vulnerable. And they certainly don't use that as an excuse to act abominably. And I've never in my entire experience worked with one client who has killed anybody and blamed their trauma on it. It does not add up. Now, I appreciate that when we look at the backgrounds of violent criminals, trauma plays into what creates them. I appreciate that. But it's not the excuse. Yes, there is a formation of activation factors that pen portrait a possibility. It exacerbates fractures in foundations, but it does not mean that you kill a child, and it does not leverage an excuse for killing that child. Now, during the trial, the prosecutors obviously moved to establish a pattern of deceit, and also they want to show the jury about the evidence tampering by Robin, because clearly that shows a very deceitful pattern of behaviour. And we're trying to make sure that there's no reasonable doubt in these cases. So if you can make that person seem uber deceitful, then that is going to mean that a jury is far more likely to feel that there is no doubt. Now, the defence, of course, they focus on portraying her as this distressed mother with PTSD who was just in a state of shock during the initial police questioning. I was just in a state of shock. Okay, were you in a state of shock when you were being questioned by the police? Yes, particularly when I changed my story when being questioned by the police. What about on the phone call to emergency services where you blamed an innocent black man who didn't exist? Yeah, I was so shocked that I imagined an apparition of what might have played out if I hadn't been guilty. And so that happened to be that fantasy. Honestly, can you imagine as the defence trying to put this together? And actually, I've watched a lot of the defence in this case, and you can go and actually watch this on court TV, but they are quite good as a defence, but they haven't got a lot to work with. So I'm not criticising them. I don't feel there was ultimately a defence to be made in this case. They go down this road of just sympathise and empathise with my client who's lost a child and who was in such shock that nothing made sense to her. But of course, the prosecution counter all this, and they've got such a slam dunk case in my belief system. So first of all, they present the security footage and also the testimony, which totally counters Robin Howington's claims. Now, the defence did file a lot of motions to suppress the statements because they were trying to say that they had been made involuntarily. Also, they alleged that there was mistreatment of her by the investigators. And I would say the investigators can sometimes be very aggressive, can't they, in interviews? when you're interrogating someone, or if you're not getting somewhere and you just know that they're guilty, your temper can fry. I also believe that it's very hard with child death. We should be consummate professionals in all ways, shapes and forms when we work in particular positions. But if you're a father or a mother and you're dealing with somebody that you genuinely believe has killed their child and they're just literally blaming everybody else, it can take its toll on you. Also, we know that a lot of interrogators will use the good cop, bad cop position. The good cop being the person who's kind to you, brings you a cup of coffee, speaks to you as if you're a human being, makes you feel that accidents happen, builds rapport with you, tries to create that relationship so they're more likely to confess. And then their partner will just be really hyper aggressive. And it's a way of breaking that person down and incentivizing them to connect with the one building rapport. So I do understand why the defense would bring in that she'd been treated unfairly, but then should you be treated that fairly if you've killed your child? Now, the prosecution's opening statement, they just painted this case of heartbreaking, preventable tragedy, that she had absolutely caused the death of her child by negligence and deception. Bear in mind, one of the big problems with this case is that Robin's obviously gone not guilty because she wants to get away with it, but also nobody knows what happened. It happened behind closed doors. So this is very much a circumstantial case. Yes, there was all this very strong evidence about her deceit. That goes without saying, and that can absolutely tally with the fact that she is the guilty party. But nobody knows what happened behind closed doors, and they are purporting that this child is responsible for the killing and that she's tried to protect the child essentially by saying that this intruder and then her ex did it. So you can understand why, even though it feels quite slam dunk in one way, there's always that possibility that the jury will be like, well, we absolutely don't know who pulled that trigger. So they're going hard on this idea that, well, you know what, whoever pulled the trigger, this could have been prevented and it should have been prevented. If you had any level of actually understanding your position as a caregiver, this child would not be dead. Now, Robin just throughout the court case continues to attempt to deny all the accusations. The course of the trial is 5 days. And as the evidence gets more and more clear against her, and as it's more obvious to the jury that she's responsible for this horrific death of Destiny, she really acts in an odd way. Now, the prosecution bring in lots of very important witnesses. So there's emotional accounts from the officers at the scene. They actually go ahead and point out in court that she acted in a very suspicious and very irrational manner. One of the officers, Andrell Cummings, who was one of the first at the scene, he said that when he walked in, and obviously Destiny's been so badly and fatally hurt, she's just on the phone when he enters the room. And when she's asked, is anyone hurt? She just points to her dying daughter, just points to her. Now, again, I know you can't draw absolute conclusions from this kind of behavior, but it's so psychologically atypical to do that. You just would be, first of all, trying to stem the wound of your child. Just put yourself in that position. And it is absolutely traumatizing when these horrendous things play out. But if a child's been shot in the chest and she's bleeding out, where are you going to be? Your hand's going to be over the hole. You're going to be doing your best to prevent her blood leaving her body even faster. And the only way you can do that is to plug it with your hands. But she's on her phone, pointing to a dying daughter so somebody else can take care of it. Now, throughout the 5-day trial, Robin Howington protests her innocence. She says things like, I did not kill my baby. She also repeatedly stated in court that Destiny wouldn't have been shot if Destiny's father hadn't come into the house that night, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But again, it's just a deflection. But like I said, it isn't as if the defense are not trying their best to support the narrative that the shooting was an absolute tragic accident. And as I've said, basically Robin's defense is just pushing home this idea of her mental state, meaning that she just got everything wrong. So the PTSD that she previously suffered, when the gunshot happened, she found it really overwhelming because of that hypervigilance state, that she was so anxious and she had this impaired judgment due to stress and drug use. and that really this was this horrific accident that she didn't know how to explain initially because she was in such a messed up state. And obviously in the end came through with the fact that it was her son, and that was a truthful story, we're meant to believe. Now, the lawyer that represented her tried to paint her as this really remorseful mother who panicked, made poor decisions, and all this is framed in the backdrop of her trying to protect her son, which is interesting. Why would she be so protective of her 2-year-old and yet so unprotective of her 5-year-old, who's actually ended up dead? Now, the defence also said, how is the mother going to be in her right mind after being questioned for 4 hours immediately after the death of her daughter? Well, no, we don't expect her to be in her right mind. Nobody in that courtroom expects Robin to be in her right mind. You expect her to have been in an absolute frenzy of fear, devastation, tragedy 4 hours after the death of her daughter, of course. But that doesn't make you lie. In fact, there is a desperation in cases where you believe that there is a perpetrator involved, which is what she suggested initially to make sure that the case is resolved. When you're an innocent victim, yes, it's absolutely grueling to lose your child and then go in for questioning. Of course it is. But also it means that you recall the information that can lead to the arrest, the incarceration, maybe even the death penalty for an individual who has stolen your child's life. So, of course, they expect somebody to be devastated, struggle in certain circumstances, but they don't expect their recall to be full of fabrication. It makes no sense whatsoever. But he went on to say, would you as a mother not be making rational decisions in that situation, in an accidental shooting that destroyed her family? So again, very much pulling on the heartstrings, but not really having any substance to that argument. Now, once the evidence was thoroughly assessed in court, it genuinely seems to have been that more and more it became evident that Robin was the one behind the gun. But again, that doesn't solve the issue, because the issue would then be, is it an accidental shooting or is it an act of malicious intent? That still has to be managed. The jury still have to conclude about that. Now, bear in mind, all the while she's claiming that her 2-year-old son was a shooter and that afterwards she moved the gun away from the scene to protect him, and that's why the gun residue found on her must have been on her hands, because she's trying to help her daughter after she was shot. That's how she got the gun residue there. But I mean, you could argue, well, burying it in the garden would have done the same. She also said that she wasn't in her right mind. She said, I'd just seen my baby shoot my daughter. And she said that she deeply regretted the events, and actually the defence said that she hoped that this tragedy could serve as a lesson to others. What is that lesson? Don't shoot your kid. You know, let's be honest. What's that lesson? Don't shoot your kid. It's a very simple lesson. Most of us don't need to learn it at all. We just know we don't want to harm our kids fatally. Now, in a desperate attempt to deny fault, she actually said in court, you just can't accept that it was an accident. No, they can't, because you've lied about everything from day dot. Now, when it comes to closing arguments and deliberations, it didn't take the jury very long to find Robin Howington guilty of reckless homicide, 2 counts of aggravated child neglect, filing a false police report, tampering with evidence, and attempted tampering with evidence. So when it came down to them talking about what was expected at this point, the district attorney's office said that she could face a minimum of 15 to 25 years in prison without parole. Now, the judge actually set at this point her sentencing hearing for the 19th of April. And then on Friday, April the 19th, she was indeed sentenced to a total of 22 years in the Tennessee Department of Corrections. The judge also set a status date of September the 6th for any motion for a new trial. Now, with respect to the sentencing, she actually did get sentenced to 35 years in total, but the sentences are to run concurrently. So that means that she'll physically serve 22. And some of you might feel that that's lenient when you consider that Destiny was 5 years old and got shot and killed in a place where she should have been protected. When it came down to the judge's summing up, he cited multiple, quote, glaringly obvious factors in his sentencing decision, including Robin Howington trying to hide the gun immediately after her daughter's shooting. And he also went on to say that she made up story after story after story. And actually, that's an underestimation, isn't it? I mean, it would have been better saying she never spoke a word of truth in any way, shape or form. She absolutely lied through her teeth constantly. And it was all about protecting her own skin and not caring about her daughter. And prosecutor Franklin Ammons, who obviously won the case, said Destiny's life was cut short by negligence and the truth could not be hidden, and it couldn't. The fact that she was on CCTV, the due diligence that they put into the forensics implicated her, the fabrication after fabrication implicating innocent people, including her own son. I don't think that as a member of a jury, you could find any doubt at all that she was the shooter, and she might have instantly regretted it, but she's the person who caused her child's death. When you think about the irresponsible parenting alone, I mean, that's going to get you a strong sentence, because it would have been neglect at the very best. And I mean, neglect with serious consequences and child endangerment and death. So that carries a weight. But with all of the additional lies, it demonstrates that this is a pattern of behaviour. Now, the judge who presided over this case, Judge Scott Green, said that the case was a solemn reminder of the weight of responsibility on parents to protect their children. And I think that one of the things that was very clear was the horror in the community, because the public reaction was massive. The community felt a real loss for Destiny. There were actually vigils, there were memorials within the community. People were devastated. They were expressing their grief. They were expressing the wish for future prevention of tragedies like this from occurring. And of course, that gun debate is a national one. There are some people who are very pro-guns. It's absolutely constitutional right in America. And there are those who are really against them. And I think cases like this really are emotive, and they show that division clearly. And I suppose the argument for some people is that Destiny would still be here if people didn't have immediate access to guns as they do in the States. But again, I appreciate I am not American, and with respect, I do not understand what it's like to have a gun or hold a gun or want a gun, but I guess that it's embedded in culture, and that's why people firmly believe they have a right to bear arms. So again, it's one of those that's up for debate. But sadly, in households like this, where there are mental health issues and apparently all this PTSD, the question is, was she somebody who should have been even allowed a gun? And maybe that's where regulation certainly needs to be shaped in a stronger form. The reality of this case is that this beautiful little girl, Destiny, with a whole life ahead of her, died in terror and horror and fear, likely at the hands of the mother who pulled the trigger. I cannot even begin to inhabit the fear that that child must have endured. I cannot imagine a child lying there bleeding out and a mother not holding her so that her last moments are at least connected with love. But that's because I'm a typical parent, like all of you with children are typical parents. And it's so distinct from how we would respond and react in this case. And I think that alone, her reaction alone, in the initial playing out of this crime demonstrates her culpability. What kind of a mother goes on her mobile whilst her baby girl bleeds out all over the floor? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, guys. It's a tough one. And like I said, this is absolutely dedicated to Destiny, because we will remember her and we will care for her in her death, as we sadly couldn't during her life. Take care. Look after yourselves. Give your kids a big cuddle and be safe. See you again next time.